A Motown classic, the late Marvin Gaye, live at the London Palladium when he was alive, of course. And you heard a wonderful medley of songs. I suppose the most famous of them all is I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Lots of things you hear through the grapevine. And there is one particular grapevine that I want to bring to your attention that has been clogged up along the way. And people are not terribly familiar with some of the problems that occur in our society. And there is one problem in particular, childhood cancer, which I thought I'd bring to your attention this particular time with Dr. Luce Della Posa, who spends his working and his, I suppose, all his living moments thinking of ways to look after children who are afflicted with this terrible condition, with cancer. But the good news about it all is that he has news to tell us about the high recovery rate of children who are afflicted with cancer. So without too much more ado, a message first, and then we'll hear from Dr. Luce. I had a telephone interview with him this morning and asked him some questions. But first, this message.
The Children's Medical Research Foundation is a private research institute located on the grounds of the Children's Hospital at Camperdown. It is committed to research into the diseases of the children of today and therefore the adults of tomorrow. We need your help. The Children's Medical Research Foundation, P.O. Box 61, Camperdown.
Just wanted to know, how many children are you treating at the present time?
We have about 300 children on who we're treating, and since 1976 we've had almost 1,200 children come through the doors.
Gosh, 1,200, that's a terrific lot, isn't
Yes.
it?
We expect to see about 90 to 100 new patients each year, and we expect to cure two-thirds of them. So of that 1,200 patients, about 800 attend clinic on a either regular basis or they come back once a year for follow-up. They're the long-term survivors.
I see. So what's the average age range that we're talking about?
Oh, the average age range is about 5. We certainly have patients up to 15 years of age, and some of our long-term follow-ups, some of our patients are over 30. One, in fact, has a family and several children.
Oh, isn't that fantastic? And look, how long is the average length of treatment?
Most children receive therapy for somewhere between 12 months and 24 months, and that usually involves medicines given intravenously and sometimes also radiotherapy.
And do they get very, very sick?
Yes, most of them in fact lose their hair. A lot of them have to come into hospital for the treatment of complications such as infections. Some of them require blood transfusions. Some of them, have other problems such as convulsions, all related to chemotherapy. Even though it's a very effective treatment, what we find is that the complication rate is very high.
I see, and it's the complication that seems to be the problem that makes them not only very ill, but in fact their lives are threatened at that time, I imagine.
That's right. And you could never be satisfied with this sort of treatment, ever. Even if we could cure 100%, the fact is that they end up coming back into hospital for long periods of time, do require a lot of supportive care. So even if I could tell you today that we could cure 100% of children, we'd still have to work out a better way of doing it. So treating someone with 2 years of treatment, disrupting their school, disrupting their family life.
So it's pretty rugged.
It is rugged. Children are very stoic and bounce back and are they're a pleasure to treat. But I find that it is a demanding process.
And Luce, have you been in this area for quite some time now? Could you tell us how long?
I've been treating children with cancer now since 1982, 83. And we've come a long way even in that period of time. Our treatments are more sophisticated. We understand more about what we're doing, and we're much more optimistic in telling patients and their parents that the outlook is bright for them.
Well, isn't that wonderful? And what has research got to do with your work?
An enormous amount. The only reason that I can sit and talk to you today and say that we can cure two-thirds of patients is because people have put the effort in to work out what is the most effective therapy. And one can't be satisfied with only curing two-thirds. One has to work and assume that you can cure the remaining third of patients. And the only way that will come is with a lot of effort in the areas of research. And it's all very nice to contribute to television sets and making the children comfortable and paying for overseas trips, but unfortunately television sets and overseas trips will never cure cancer. And you really have to sort of take stock of where you put the money and aim to put it into an area that you think that at least if this generation won't benefit, that perhaps the next or the one after will benefit.
Luch, that's fantastic. What can you say to people to make them more aware and certainly more generous?
I think they have to probably appreciate that we've come a very long way in 10 to 15 years. We've gone from expecting most children to die to a position where we expect most children to live, and that's come directly through people being adventurous and researching and working out the most effective way of treating children, and we haven't reached our goals yet. And when you're looking at children and watching them suffer and watching them endure these treatments, it doesn't take very much to realise that that's where the money ought to be spent in attempting to cure patients.
Luch, thank you very, very much for your time and for your concern, and thank you for treating our children with cancer.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and God bless.
Some of it's given.
Cancer, I think of pain and treatments that sometimes seem worse than death. And then the watching and the waiting for some sign of remission or halt to the disease. Really, it's a real puzzle. What is cancer?
Well, cancers are an uncontrolled growth of some part of the body. Most people would be aware that the body is composed of millions of cells and they organise themselves into various organs. These cells know when to divide, when to stop dividing, when to mature. And for some reason, in one particular cell, this information is lost, and the cell starts to divide, and one cell becomes 2 cells, becomes 4, becomes 8, and this continues until eventually it reaches a size that we can detect, and it's obvious the patient in these circumstances has cancer. And this might present as a lump, but more commonly in children, it presents as low blood counts.
I see. I suppose trying to detect it, if a mother was trying to, if they noticed that their child was off colour or something, how long would they go, if they did notice a lump? How long do you think they should go before they really do something about it, take them to the doctor? What would be your advice on that?
Well, lumps in children particularly are very, very common, and most of the times a simple infection is the reason for the child developing the lump, and the lump is generally a gland. But these lumps usually only are obvious for 2 to 3 weeks. If a lump is clearly increasing in size or doesn't disappear after 2 to 3 weeks, then I think a visit to the doctor is essential. More commonly, or rather the commonest cause of cancer, or form of cancer in childhood, is leukemia. And whilst lumps are commonly associated with leukemia, often the child is pale and is lethargic and is irritable, and parents often notice over a period of 2 to 3 weeks or longer that the child doesn't eat as well, is tired after getting home from school, or doesn't have the same amount of energy. And I think under those circumstances, a visit to the doctor to find out whether the child is anemic or not is advisable.
Now, if cancer is detected, how does it affect the child? Do you talk about the cancer to the child? I mean, we'll get on to the parents in a moment, but I'm sort of interested in the child. I suppose it very much depends on the age. But let's say we're talking about a child who is 8, all right, a difficult age.
Well, yes, it does depend very largely on the age of the child. Clearly, a 2-year-old child has no conception as to what's happening. An 8-year-old child must have the disease explained to him or her in language that they can understand. By 8 years of age, they have some, or rather have their ideas of death are reasonably well formed, and they've clearly associated with cancer with death through things they've learnt at school, on television, and listening to their own parents. So it's important that you sit down and say that the illness is serious. It's absolutely important that you are truthful and you make that clear to the child right at the beginning, and you answer all the questions that they pose you in a very straightforward and honest fashion. I'm grateful that I'm dealing with children, in that I know that most children will be cured, and so I can present a very positive attitude to them. Most 8-year-old children wouldn't be terribly concerned, or rather they wouldn't show their concern in a very obvious fashion to me, and most of them accept the diagnosis and the subsequent treatment remarkably well.
How do their parents cope when they know?
Now, this is entirely different. I warn the child when I speak to them, and generally the parents are with me, that the parents will often break down and cry. And this is not because the child is going to die, but rather because the parents realise that the treatment is going to be difficult. And I like to warn the child and point out to them that the parents are breaking down and crying because they love them very, very much. As you can appreciate, most people conceive of cancer, or rather when they think of cancer and death, they think of it in the same breath or in the same sentence. And I'd like to really strongly emphasise that in children, most childhood cancer is curable. And so when you tell a parent their child has cancer, they're usually devastated by it. And what you end up doing is spending a lot of time talking to them about cancer, feeding them the positive side of our unit and the work we do, and point out to them that it's very likely the child will be cured. There are a few occasions when we know before we start that the cancer is so widespread or so aggressive that we can't cure, but perhaps we can delay death in children. The sort of support the parents need are mainly talking to. If you can talk to them and make it clear to them what's going on, so that they can understand the disease and the plan of treatment, then I find that most parents cope remarkably well. But they do go through this horrible phase where they grieve the loss to some extent of their child, in that they have to bring the child for therapy on a very regular basis. They have to. It disrupts their lives. Often it disrupts their employment. It can mean a loss of income to them. We can generally cope with that. We can provide support, both financial, but more importantly emotional, so that they can pull through the early phase. And it's remarkable, after about 6 to 8 weeks, most parents have their act together. They still cry silently and they're still very upset, but they do get on with the business of living and very quickly adopt a positive approach and feel that their child will be amongst the children who are cured.
That's terrifically encouraging to hear that people have to go through these stages to reach some sort of a plateau. Now, what happens to brothers and sisters in the family? Because after all, when a child knows this and the parents know, well, it really is a major catastrophe to that family. And I wondered how, and of course this again depends on the ages of the brothers and sisters, but let's say they are around about the same age, a couple of years older and a couple of years younger. How do they cope?
Well, children have unusual conceptions of events around them, and it's very important to involve any siblings of children with cancer. At least speak to them and point out a few things. One is that they were in no way responsible for the cancer, because often there's, in most families, there's a degree of sibling rivalry, and they compete, and there may have been an incident in the last 1 or 2 months. For example, one child may have hit the other child, and now one of them has cancer, and the other may feel responsible for it. So it's important that you clear up these misconceptions, and you do it in a very precise fashion, and answer any of their queries. That generally doesn't pose a problem. What does pose a problem is the attention that the child with cancer usually ends up receiving through no fault of his own. You find that the parents' lives start to revolve around this child. The parents have to bring the child into the clinic or to the ward often 5 days a week. And then any plans that family had for family activities is totally disrupted. More importantly, plans such as to go on holidays are postponed. They find they can't go to the Royal Easter Show, for example, because one of their brother is sick from either therapy or for the cancer. So it's important that this is explained to them, that it's recognised, and that the parents go out of their way to provide individual time and attention to each of their children, not concentrate solely on the child with cancer. It's also very important that the parents do not change their attitude towards the child with cancer. And let me digress just a little bit here. Particularly grandparents might feel the diagnosis of cancer is a fatal diagnosis, and go out and spoil the child with gifts and treat him differently. Now, children with cancer they're very, very smart. They'll appreciate a change in attitude, a change in behaviour on the parents' or grandparents' part. And whilst they'll take advantage of any gifts that come their way, it's important to realise that children with cancer are in fact normal, and they will behave and react normally. There's a strong tendency in families to alter their behaviour or relationship with the child who has cancer. Most times this might take the form of a change in discipline. The discipline is not as strict, or it might take you might end up spoiling the child. Now, the children are in fact very smart, and they'll appreciate that if they did something wrong 2 months ago and they were punished for it, and now because they have cancer, if they did the same thing, they get away with it, whilst they'll probably exploit that, they'll also realise that they must be dreadfully sick, otherwise the parents wouldn't let them get away with it. And that's a very uncomfortable feeling, and often it may be responsible for a change in the child's personality. The child become quite aggressive. The other thing is that we subject the children with cancer to fairly aggressive therapy, and a lot of it is given by injection. And despite their age, children appreciate that doctors are responsible for it, but they don't get angry with the doctors or the nurses. They take it out on the parents themselves, and mostly this is done through temper tantrums or changes in behaviour, and that can be particularly disruptive and disconcerting to parents. I think one of the commonest complaints I have, or one of the commonest questions that parents come to me for help with, is a change in behaviour. And I repeatedly emphasise that it's important that you maintain your standard of discipline or whatever after the diagnosis is made. It's okay to empathise with the child, to cry with the child, but it's very, very important that the child learns to appreciate that the therapy must be given, and irrespective of how much he hates it, there's no way around it.
It's really hard when you think of how strong the parents have to be to maintain the status quo, as it were. That would be the ideal situation if possible, and I guess that takes a bit of time before they can really shake down into being as normal as possible. It sounds like a really tough area of medicine, Doctor, to be in. Could you tell us why you choose to practice in this field of medicine?
That's a harder question for me to answer than many of the others. I was influenced by a doctor who was out in Australia about 8 years ago whilst I was a student, and my conception of cancer then was what I think most people think of cancer of now, and that it was mainly terminal, or rather it was most patients ended up dying. But he brought with him and to me a very special enthusiasm that I was very grateful for, and ever since that time I'd always endeavoured to practice in the field of cancer in childhood, and I'm very glad that I chose that field. It's a very rewarding field, and I know most people feel that it is a demanding area, but in fact I don't find that at all. I quite enjoy it. It's very stimulating. A lot of the advances have been made in the past few years, and I'm full of hope for the future. I expect that within the next few decades that the vast majority of children with cancer will be cured, and it is hard to see my own patients die occasionally. But I live for the day when I don't have to face that, and that most of them will grow to adulthood and have families.
Thank you, Doctor. It's wonderful talking to you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.